I took a look this summer at a bunch of old sermons just to get a sense of their awfulness. What did I think about in the early 90s? How old are my obsessions, my tics, and my crotchets? I may be the only one here who cares about these questions, these occasional tremors of hopeless navel-gazing, but hopeless navel-gazing is what I do best. It's a leg of the journey. It's part of the process. On some of my best days, it's who I am. It won't surprise you that it wasn't pretty, or at least it wasn't pretty to me. Nothing I wrote sounds exactly right. And it goes on and on like a roll of toweling paper. For a while in the 80s, it was nuclear war, which I ratcheted up to catastrophe and annihilation. I printed bumper stickers, which, big surprise, I still have, that proclaim, in a nuclear attack, this car will melt. I gave them out like I was a candy lady at a synagogue, bringing joy and delight to members of the congregation. I picked one of these sermons out of the secret files, and I wish that Merrick Garland had seized it in a raid. It rattled on the tracks for a good 40 pages, which meant that it took about an hour and a half to deliver. For the record, a sermon should be less than that and take about as long as this one, and after that, it's time for lunch. Of course, that was only half the frittata. The other part of it was what I said, how often I said it, and a kind of genius for a sharp stick in the eye. The best example may be my very first sermon, the one I gave when I graduated from rabbinical school. This exercise is called the senior sermon, a gruesome moment in the synagogue of the seminary, in front of world-famous professors and movement muckety-mucks, and there's also your visiting parents and your younger brother. In those days, the idea was to move to Israel. Everybody wanted to move to Israel, to be an Israeli soldier and to be a hero. The air was thick with romance and fantasy. And if you couldn't go, you had to talk about it incessantly. My sharp stick at the time was that this made me crazy. For better and for worse, I am hopelessly American, a competitive, talky son of the Midwest with a very strong taste for fries and a Coke. I did not want to wear a uniform, and I was committed to the idea of a world Jewish community. So I pointed out to my professors and fellow students that the Torah was given in the middle of the desert, and it could be read and lived anywhere in the world, and that act had value in Tel Aviv and Kansas City. You would have thought that I had announced the Inquisition. Many people sat in stony silence. When it was done, a man named Rabbi Wolf Kelman hissed in my ear as I returned to my chair. The phrase he used was, Sonei Yisrael. Now, you actually can't say anything worse that does not contain a body part or an expletive. He called me a hater of the people Israel. As you can imagine, this was a very bad thing. To make matters worse, he was in charge of placement. If Wolf Kelman liked you, you ended up in Manhattan. If Wolf Kelman hated you, you ended up in Kansas City. And that, as they say, is the rest of the story. Fortunately, I liked Kansas City very much, even though it did not always like me. There was that endless business with nuclear war and a couple of sermons that were equally tedious. This was also the beginning of my walking out period. I never actually walked out on anyone, but people kept walking out on me, drawn irresistibly to the theater of the high holidays. Once again, it was the sharp stick of my politics, self-critical, questioning left-wing Zionism. A guy named Barry from an ancient Jewish family rose from his seat and shouted me down. I have never been assassinated, but I can imagine what it feels like. If anyone else rose in my defense, it had nothing to do with approval for my politics. Normal people just don't like to see other people bleed. I wish that I could say that Tulsa was different. But for the first 50 miles, it was pretty much the same. On my first day of work in 1985, I sat down with the president and administrator of the synagogue. That was the late Ron Kriegsman and the ever-radiant Shirley Levin. That office is gone, but I remember it well. A tiny cubicle at the end of the hallway, stained brown carpeting coming away from the walls. I was the son of a carpet salesman, so that really bugged me. As nicely as possible, they shared their assessment. Rank and file members were ambivalent about my arrival, and the senior leadership hated my guts. To be perfectly honest, I couldn't blame them. The young Turks who recruited me wanted what they wanted. It was a wholesale shift in culture and practice, growth in membership, a new way of praying, women on the bima, a busy calendar, instrumental music, and charismatic leadership. I actually wanted those things myself, and I have always resisted the constraints of our movement, but I tried not to think of myself as the Messiah. The problem is that many people saw me as Satan. They quickly deciphered the folds of my psyche. I wasn't actually a fresh Orthodox rabbi, and I had broken all the locks on the doors. I had real affection for Rabbi Kahn, but they came to understand that I wasn't Rabbi Kahn. I wasn't even Rabbi Peru. It didn't help that I tried to be nice. I simply wasn't a true believer. And then there was the matter of those pesky sermons, the ones that went from here to Varklan. I spoke about Israel. I spoke about farm policy. I spoke my heart about Ronald Reagan. Once I spoke about Reagan and farm policy. And people kept walking out very publicly, like right up the aisle on Yom Kippur. And they did it slowly in order to make the point. On top of that, I got nowhere fast. In the Jewish community of Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time, B'nai Emunah was a second-string player. We sort of counted and we sort of didn't, hampered by being a tribe of traditionalists who were uncomfortable with women, and most especially people who weren't native to the Jewish community. The bright, shiny place where the good stuff was happening was just down the street and less than a mile away. We were hunkered down in a crumbling building with brown carpet in the sanctuary pulling away from the walls. Have I already mentioned that there was no natural light in this place? It takes years to turn a big ship in the water, and there were plenty of people who didn't want it turned at all. I would say charitably that we were all stalled out, and no amount of work seemed to make a difference. And then mysteriously, the current shifted. It wasn't so much that we got a new building. That didn't happen until the turn of this century. And you don't build a building until you feel strong and optimistic. It began to happen a long time before that. The people who hated me got tired of hating me. It's as if somebody turned a key on the motor. At some point, I didn't seem to be leaving town, and people began to think of me as an unloved cousin. I had married in, but I dressed appropriately, and I was perfectly tolerable as long as I didn't say much at family events. Either that or those same people moved away. Any which way, they stopped wishing I were dead. It helped that our changes, even substantial ones, were slow and incremental, like evolution. I wanted everything to move forward urgently. And to this day, I regret my hesitation. But anything faster would have been suicidal. On top of everything else, I was happier. And I would like to think that it made a difference. I could send out more happiness and got more happiness back. It was a feedback loop of circulating positives that somehow displaced all that came before it. I focused less on the swamp of discontent and came to concentrate on my great good fortune. Even though there were bumps along the way, I had come to a place where I actually belonged, where I could understand the language of a Jewish community that was neither coastal, self-important, or metropolitan, but smart and mobilized and aspirational. I was not an anonymous cog in a machine, but one of the people with my hand on the wheel. And those other people were smart and mobilized and capable of translating their aspirations. It's been the great professional experience of my life. And that is exactly what I've come to say this morning. It will be a miracle if I get through the rest. I've been planning for this moment for a very long time. Not a big fan of abrupt transitions, and I certainly don't care for cascades of glitter. The first would feel like dropping off a cliff, and the second strikes me as gauche and cheesy. I've always wanted to back my way out of the circle, to ease down the road away from the center, and simply to continue the journey in another way. What I owe to my colleagues, especially my successor, is to make room for their efforts, to valorize their gifts, and to acknowledge the great good fortune of my life and say that it is time for someone else. And then to do all of this without regret or complaint. I wanted to practice stepping back, to let the questions and kudos flow to someone else, and with the permission of our board, thoughtful always, enlightened always, I did just that, gradually scaling back on public responsibilities so that I was not quite as visible as I had been before. COVID helped. Because it was COVID, I probably worked harder than before. But the pandemic paradoxically helped enormously. You probably thought that I was a COVID weenie. I am most certainly a COVID weenie. But every hour that I spent at my desk at home meant that other people were answering questions, making judgment calls, and practicing their moves. COVID may have been bad for everyone, but it turned out to be a useful catastrophe. It gave me time to step out of the limelight so other good people could begin to shine. So now, it's time to do more of the same. To take one more step, to get on the moving sidewalk and glide through the concourse with a smile and a wave. And it begins with offering bouquets to all of you. I haven't mentioned it in a very long time, but I came to Tulsa with a broken spirit. I would always say that I loved Kansas City. In fact, I said it already today. But then came the part that I didn't like at all. And it wasn't about a handful of sermons. It was a deeper issue of synagogue politics and an explosion that I was too young to manage. I left Kansas City of my own accord, but not before I was hung out to dry. The gory details are still a little gory, and I've had time to think about them for 40 years. But I think I can give you a capsule summary. If you are the only one who cares about asbestos, who feels threatened by asbestos, and believes what science says about asbestos, there is no good way to stand up to those who don't. I do not mean to make myself a hero. When it comes to physical courage, I am never the hero. And I'm not going to die of environmental toxins unless I take a new job at the refineries in West Tulsa, which are, for the record, exactly 10 feet away. What I am is nervous and alert and agitated. And you seem to understand that and take it as a given without pathologizing my quirks and aversions. I can't help what I feel, and I feel it deeply. Hardly any of you were here at the time. And if you were here at the synagogue, you may not have noticed. But I need someone to know, I need all of you to know that it was one of the things that cemented this relationship. And it was real, and it was concrete, and it was an act of love. At the time, we were in the building before this one. In the building, there was a decrepit gym, and the ceiling of that gym was sprayed with cellulose. I knew in my heart that it was intermixed with asbestos. But there was a general consensus that the ceiling was clear. And then suddenly it became clear that it was not. I went away for my summer vacation and came back to Tulsa 10 days later. To this day, I do not know how it happened. But when I arrived, the ceiling had been stripped. No one said a word about it, before or after or in between. It was the kindest thing you could possibly have done, and I have never, ever lost track of that moment. It is also weird to talk about a ceiling, to talk about cellulose, to talk about any of this. But I feel if I don't, it would be wrong and ungrateful. At the risk of sounding like Sally Fields, you made me feel like you cared about all of me, that I was a person who mattered, body and soul. And then there is the matter of my family and my children. A kid I knew during my childhood in Detroit was the son of a rabbi at a flagship synagogue. I wanted what he had, a father for a rabbi. But I was never unaware of the price he paid. He was a constant target of gossip and speculation, and his older brother endured exactly the same, how they dressed, how they spoke, how they combed their hair. I was a sort of friend, but my family was the same. We talked about all of them all the time. And we were not alone in the way we treated that family. In those days, it was the common lot of rabbis and their children, a pattern of incessant judgmental chatter, sometimes loving, more often critical, where children especially were subject to the scrutiny, we reserve for the children of real celebrities, Sasha and Malia, Chelsea Clinton, Chaz Bono, all of the Kardashians. It was the withering analysis of their clothes and playthings, the cars they drove and the friends they made. You could have choked on the constant, unremitting flow, strangled by a kind of proprietary interest. My children, our children, might say something else. They grew up in a wonderland of benign attention. People were interested but never suffocated them. Like their father, they felt the care of their community, the fragrant combination of food and love, and 1,000 acts of generosity that were walked through our door like so many kugels. People no doubt had their opinions, but never burdened any of us with judgment, even when the temptations were enormous and irresistible. We had to do things that were likely controversial. At one point, the day school became the wrong place for Micah, so we started him on the path to the Episcopal priesthood. It was either that or a career at the Vatican. I think many people had opinions about all of this, but they somehow managed to avoid sharing them with us. And my children managed to press the limits themselves. There was the year that Micah dyed his hair midnight blue. Nina went to school dressed like Madonna, right down to the circles of jet black eyeliner. That was right before she grew out her hair in dreadlocks, which, in retrospect, all of us found politically incorrect. There were numerous sightings of both of them at Weber's, and it wasn't just for onion rings and floats. I'll leave the rest to your active imaginations. Yet neither felt hammered by the disapproval of this congregation. They met their counterparts at Jewish summer camps and told stories about gatherings at the synagogue table. They told stories of feeling mothered by the synagogue, about being asked about their lives and their plans and their prospects. Nina came back, and Micah visits often. That never happens with a place that you hate. And their mother might say exactly the same. Okay, we live in a bright red state. Forgive me if Oklahoma is exactly the way you like it. We probably weren't scripted to live in a place where you can go to prison for thinking about abortion. But you supported my wife in a brilliant career that is arguably more public and productive than mine in the most contentious domains of public policy. That means reproductive justice, systemic racism, differential incarceration, gender and sexuality. Her name has always been different from mine, and she gave that name to both of our children. She's honest. She swears. She does exactly what she likes. At the beginning, you thought that she was a communist sympathizer. And she did absolutely nothing to deny the charge. And she makes beautiful plum cakes each year for the high holidays. She is Leon Trotsky meets Martha Stewart. And yet none of this seemed to matter at all, at least in the way you embrace the whole of her. Alice will continue working for a very long time. Otherwise, I will never survive. But I will survive, and it's thanks to all of you, Alice included. I've had a deeply satisfying and joyful run. I've said it so often that I've worn out the record, but whatever troubles I've had as a rabbi, they have nothing to do with this congregation. You never asked me to do anything immoral or to behave in a way that brought me shame. My troubles, all of them, are entirely my own. I'm a little thin-skinned. I'm a little fastidious. I'm a little obsessed and a little particular. I keep pressing the buttons until the very last minute, and I am never really done with the task. But whatever my failings, you gave me the resources to do what I needed and the ability to move beyond the confines of Synagogue. And we managed to do this in meaningful relationship. This used to be a mid-century place. It was a schedule of services, a school for children, 2 kosher kitchens, and a calendar for yard sites. All those things are still intact. I would assert that they will go on forever, but there are many others that now stand side by side. Robust social activism, brilliant music making, a pro-social bakery, a role in the larger culture. It's the demanding programmatics of environmental sustainability and a new way that Tulsa looks at the synagogue. We started out with a children's literacy program at McClure, turned that into English language for immigrants, grew that into advocacy for persons without documents, transformed that into legal work with Catholic Charities, and we now operate an agency under the auspices of the State Department. That final step is a credit to Rabbi Kamen, who has mastered the intricacies of working with the federal government. Whatever I have managed to do for any of you, this is what I needed the most. You gave me independence and responsibility. And freedom to do the things that captured my heart. That included books about ironing and house cleaning, with a sidebar trip into vernacular photography. There will be another rabbi who exhibits at Philbrook, but I don't know him yet, and probably never will. And I couldn't have done any of this without you, because I operated in the best place for me. Ask me to sketch the culture of the synagogue, and I would say that we are entrepreneurial, driven by the force of good ideas and mobilized by the marketplace in which we compete. This is what the entire Jewish world will look like, less concerned about borders and denominations, but loose and fluid, picking up the signals of our members. Mark my words, 30 years from now, everything in America will look like B'nai Emunah. Instead of being consumed by politics, instead of being stymied by authority, we aspire to a state of graceful flow. We are not bound by the strictures of legal documents, but an intuitive sense of what the Jewish world should look like. We seem to have little patience for the minutiae of governance, and we pursue constant evaluative consultation, not the deadening forms of administration, but a joyful and hopping appetite for the new. If I were charged to invent a new motto, it would be, we do stuff, and then we do something else. Who needs a new parking lot? We need a new parking lot. Plans are complete, but not the fundraising. We need a bunch of you listening to this message this morning. Step forward and help furnish the financial resources. It will happen. And then we'll go on to something else. One way or another, we need to keep moving and get the job done always and forever. So what happens next? I'm not sure that it matters really, but more transitioning, at least for me. I think about it as a process of rabbinopause. The gradual shedding of roles and functions and their replacement with new opportunities. I know that I don't want to do anything abruptly, so I hope you won't mind if I hang around a little longer. That parking lot project really interests me. I've got a taste for back office task work. Somebody finally has to tackle the basement and continue to organize the library and the archive. In the next few months, I will be relocating to the stage so that the man beside me can take over my office and make it an orderly center of activity. Meantime, I can spread out like I have always dreamed and do some serious Scandinavian death cleaning. I promise to let you know how it goes. The technical term for all of this is tzimtzum, a rigorous exercise of self-regulation, self-limitation, and self-constraint. Nothing overbearing, with sensible boundaries. And in another dimension, I'm ready to expand. Abortion in Oklahoma needs plenty of attention. So do voter registration and race relations. I don't pretend that I am anyone's answer, but I'd like to spend time on all of these issues and do the same in environment and sustainability. I also want to have a second career in a dozen fields that have always called to me. I own 6 sewing machines that have been underused. I own 5 cameras that have been underused. I own 4 rolling pins that have been underused. I have begun to work on digital altarpieces that turn my political rage into tangible images. If you've spent a microsecond worried about my boredom, I think I can say that I will not be bored and no one has to worry about me. So yes, this is a kind of final message. It's the full circle moment where I begin to wrap it up. And say the things that have been in my heart, how I feel, how I got here, how it was hard, how it worked out. How I feel grateful, and then still more grateful to all of you. How I have enormous confidence in the man who will follow me. All that remains is to tell you the meaning of life. Do your work as best you can. If there are people you love, try never to fail them. And if you do, apologize and atone. And then turn your face to the broken world and work as if your hair is on fire to alleviate suffering and heal the wounded. Never pass a shattered human being without doing something to bring restoration and repair. This is what the God of Israel wants from us. That's what it means to hear the voice of God. I've been paying close attention this year to the aesthetics of transition. How do people get from here to there? Move from one life to life 2.0. I was charmed by a story in the press this summer that the butter sculptor for the Minnesota State Fair gave her butter knife to her own successor. It's the one she's been using for nearly 4 decades to get the details right on her sculptures. I don't have a butter knife to give to Rabbi Kamen. And besides, his job is not to make sculptures in butter. But I do have something that might be meaningful. On the day that Rabbi Peru cleaned out his office, he cleared the shelves and he licked them clean. But he left one thing behind for those who would follow him. It was a little shofar, barely larger than my hand, so that its sound would reverberate long after his departure. Rabbi Kamen, I offer this shofar to you. I haven't exactly yet cleaned my shelves, but it's time for someone else to blow the shofar. It's time for all of us to blow it together with you. Blessings on your hands, blessings on your heart, and blessings on your mind. And gratitude to all of you for your kindness and your love. So may it be the will of the living God, and let us all say, Amen, Amen.